Victoria never imagined that her greatest sacrifice for love would turn out to be the biggest lie of her life. For the third night this week, she picked up another double shift at Denver General Hospital. 18 hours straight, and she still had 4 more to go. Their bills kept piling up while Michael struggled to find steady work as a janitor. Every night, he came home with rejection letters and empty promises. The landlord's final notice sat on their table like a ticking bomb. When rent was due and they had nothing left, Victoria made the hardest decision of her life. She sold her grandmother's wedding ring for $800. That ring was the last connection to her family's history. Michael came home each night, exhausted from cleaning office buildings for minimum wage. Victoria stretched every dollar, making meals for whatever was on sale. Coupons became her best friend, saving 50 cents here and there. The stack of overdue notices grew taller each week. She worked every extra shift available, sometimes staying awake for 20 hours straight. Coffee became her lifeline to get through those endless shifts. Each morning, Michael thanked her for the lunch she packed in brown paper bags. Peanut butter and jelly sandwiches were all they could afford. Her scrubs were falling apart, but buying new ones wasn't an option. When coworkers invited her out, Victoria always declined, claiming they couldn't afford it. What Victoria didn't know was that everything she believed about their struggle was a lie. Comment below where you're watching from, and if you've ever sacrificed everything for love. Hit like if you want to see how this story unfolds, and subscribe for more incredible, true stories. 6 years ago, Victoria walked into Murphy's Coffee House on 5th Street, rushing between her nursing classes and her part-time job at the clinic. The place was packed with students and professionals, and there was only one empty table left in the corner near the window. Victoria remembered thinking how lucky she was to find a spot, not knowing that moment would change her entire life. The autumn leaves were falling outside, creating this perfect backdrop for what felt like a scene from a romantic movie. The air smelled like cinnamon and coffee beans, and there was this gentle buzz of conversation that made the whole place feel alive and welcoming. That's when Victoria noticed him at the counter, this handsome man in worn jeans and a faded blue shirt, counting out quarters and dimes for a simple black coffee. The barista was getting impatient, tapping her fingers on the counter while other customers shifted restlessly behind him. Victoria could see the embarrassment in his eyes as he realized he was 50 cents short for even the smallest coffee they offered. There was something about his dignity in that moment of struggle that touched her heart deeply. He wasn't making excuses or getting angry, just quietly accepting that he couldn't afford the coffee he wanted. His shoulders slumped slightly, and he started to back away from the counter with such grace and humility that it took her breath away. Without thinking twice, Victoria stepped forward and handed the barista a $5 bill before Michael could walk away. "His coffee is on me," she said, surprising herself with her boldness because she was usually shy around strangers. Michael turned to look at her with these beautiful brown eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 thank yous and apologies all at once. He tried to refuse, saying he couldn't accept charity from a stranger, but something in his voice told Victoria he was genuinely grateful while also being embarrassed by his situation. She insisted it wasn't charity, just one person helping another, the way the world should work. "Besides," she said with a smile, "maybe you can return the favor someday, when she is the one short on change." The relief and gratitude that washed over his face was worth far more than $5. Michael asked if he could buy her a coffee in return, and even though he clearly couldn't afford it, Victoria said yes because she wanted to talk to him more than anything. They sat at that corner table for 3 hours, talking about everything and nothing while their coffee grew cold. He told her he was working odd jobs while looking for something more stable, cleaning offices at night and doing construction during the day when he could find work. Victoria shared her dreams of becoming a nurse and how she was working multiple jobs to pay for school. There was this incredible honesty between them, like they'd known each other for years instead of minutes. She was drawn to his humility and the way he spoke about wanting to build something meaningful with his life, not just chase money or status. He had this quiet strength that made her feel safe and understood in a way she'd never experienced before. When the coffee shop was closing at 9, Michael walked Victoria to her car, even though it was 6 blocks in the opposite direction from where he needed to catch the bus home. They exchanged numbers, and he promised to call her the next day, though he warned her his phone was a cheap prepaid model that sometimes didn't work well. As Victoria drove home that night, she couldn't stop smiling or thinking about the genuine connection they'd shared. There was something special about Michael, something pure and real that she'd never encountered before in the dating world. He wasn't trying to impress her with money or status, just with his genuine personality and kind heart. She found herself already looking forward to his call, hoping that what she felt wasn't just one-sided attraction. Their first official date was a picnic in Cheeseman Park because Michael said he wanted to do something special but couldn't afford a fancy restaurant. He made sandwiches and brought a thermos of lemonade in a worn backpack, and they spent the afternoon talking under an old oak tree. Victoria loved that he was honest about his financial situation instead of pretending to be something he wasn't. Most men she'd dated before tried to impress her with expensive dinners or flashy cars. But Michael's authenticity was more attractive than any material gesture could have been. They talked about their families, their dreams, and their fears while watching children play on the swings nearby. He told her about his mother who had raised him alone, and she shared stories about her grandmother who had inspired her to become a nurse. After a year of dating, Michael proposed with a simple silver ring he'd saved for months to buy. He apologized that it wasn't a diamond, but Victoria told him it was perfect because it came from his heart. They had a small courthouse wedding with just her best friend Diana and his friend James as witnesses. Victoria wore a simple white dress from a department store, and Michael wore his only suit, but they were both glowing with happiness. The judge who married them commented on how much love he could see between them, and Victoria remembered thinking that they had something money couldn't buy. They celebrated afterward at a diner, sharing a piece of apple pie and talking about their dreams for the future. They moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment in a building that had seen better days, but it was theirs. Michael apologized for not being able to afford something nicer, but Victoria assured him it was perfect for starting their life together. They furnished it with secondhand finds and pieces his mother gave them, creating a cozy home filled with love, if not luxury. On their first night there, they sat on the floor, eating takeout Chinese food and planning how they'd make it beautiful. Michael promised Victoria that someday he'd give her the life she deserved, with a real house and nice things. She told him she already had everything she needed as long as she had her by her side. In those early days of marriage, they were so happy despite having so little money. Michael would surprise Victoria with handwritten notes in her lunch bag, and she'd leave little love messages in his work clothes. They'd have romantic dinners by candlelight, not because it was atmospheric, but because they'd forgotten to pay the electric bill and had to use candles. They'd laugh about it instead of crying, finding joy in the smallest things. Michael always said that what mattered wasn't what they had, but what they had together. Victoria fell deeper in love with him every day, admiring his optimism and determination to build a better life for them. Victoria believed with all her heart that they were building something beautiful together, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. Michael's humility and struggle seemed so genuine, so real, that she never questioned anything about his background or his family. She was completely convinced that she had found a man who loved her for who she was, not what she could give him. Little did she know that everything she believed about their love story was about to be tested in ways she never could have imagined. But in those early days, she was the happiest woman alive, married to a man she thought she knew completely. Their married life settled into a routine that Victoria thought was temporary, but would somehow stretch on for 5 long years. Every morning at 5:30, she'd wake up to get ready for her shift at Denver General, while Michael was still sleeping after his night shift cleaning office buildings. She'd kiss him goodbye gently, try not to wake him, and head out into the cold Denver morning with her thermos of coffee and the lunch she'd packed the night before. Victoria truly believed they were in the struggling phase that every young couple goes through, the phase that would eventually lead to better days when Michael found steady work and she could advance in her nursing career. At the hospital, Victoria worked every shift she could get her hands on often staying for 12 or 16 hours straight when they needed extra coverage. Her supervisor always praised her dedication, not knowing that behind her work ethic was pure financial desperation. She'd take care of patients with broken bones and serious illnesses, giving them hope and comfort, while inside, she was worried sick about their own mounting bills. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was helping heal others while her own life felt like it was slowly falling apart financially. Her feet would ache so badly from standing all day that she'd soak them in ice water when she got home, but she never complained to Michael because she knew he was struggling just as much. Michael would come home from his janitor jobs looking absolutely defeated, his clothes dirty and his hands rough from the harsh cleaning chemicals. He'd tell Victoria about the office buildings he cleaned, how the executives would walk past him like he was invisible, and how hard it was to find additional work that paid decent wages. He seemed genuinely frustrated with the situation, often spending hours on the computer looking for better job opportunities that never seemed to materialize. Victoria would massage his shoulders and tell him that things would get better, that his hard work would eventually pay off. He always thanked her for believing in him, and she could see what looked like real guilt in his eyes for not being able to provide better for them. Every month was a juggling act with their finances that left Victoria exhausted and anxious. She'd sit at their small kitchen table with a calculator, trying to figure out which bills they could pay and which ones they'd have to let slide until the next paycheck. The electric bill, the rent, groceries, her student loan payments from nursing school, Michael's bus pass for work, their cheap health insurance that barely covered anything. Victoria became an expert at stretching every dollar, shopping with coupons, buying generic brands, and making meals that would last for days. She'd lie awake at night, doing math in her head, calculating how many extra shifts she'd need to work to catch up on their overdue accounts. Grocery shopping became an exercise in creativity and sacrifice that Victoria never thought she'd have to master as an adult. She'd spend an hour going through the weekly ads, clipping coupons, and planning meals around what was on sale. They ate a lot of pasta, rice, and beans because they were filling and cheap. Victoria would walk past the meat section, looking longingly at the steaks and fresh fish that other people were putting in their carts, while she headed to the discount section for markdown items that were close to their expiration date. Michael never complained about the simple meals she prepared, always thanking her and telling her she was an amazing cook even when dinner was just spaghetti with tomato sauce for the third time that week. Victoria's dream of becoming a nurse practitioner felt more impossible with each passing month as she watched other nurses advance their careers while she stayed stuck in the same position. The application fees alone for the programs she wanted were more than their monthly grocery budget, and the idea of taking on more student loan debt when they could barely make their current payments seemed insane. She'd look at the brochures for advanced nursing programs and calculate that it would take her at least 3 years to save enough money just for the application process, let alone the tuition. Michael would find her sometimes staring at these materials, and he'd promise that someday he'd be able to support them while she went back to school, but someday felt like a lifetime away. Their dinner conversations often revolved around money and their plans for getting out of their financial situation, discussions that felt both hopeful and heartbreaking at the same time. Michael would talk about job interviews he'd had that seemed promising but never led to anything, and Victoria would share stories from work about patients and coworkers, while carefully avoiding mentioning how some of her colleagues were buying houses and taking vacations. They'd dream about having a real dining room someday, maybe even a house with a yard, but those dreams felt so far away they might as well have been fantasies. Despite their struggles, those dinners were often the best part of Victoria's day because they were together, supporting each other through what she believed was just a difficult chapter in their love story. Even small luxuries like doing laundry became calculated expenses that required planning and sacrifice. They'd go to the laundromat once a week with a bag of quarters Victoria had been saving, and she'd carefully measure out the cheapest detergent to make it last longer. Victoria would watch other people's clothes tumbling in multiple machines while she waited for their single load to finish, trying not to feel sorry for herself, but sometimes failing. Her nursing scrubs were getting thin from so many washings, and Michael's work clothes were starting to fall apart, but replacing them wasn't in their budget. She'd patch small holes and sew on buttons, try to make everything last as long as possible while telling herself that taking care of their belongings was just being responsible. Their entertainment budget was essentially zero, so their evenings were spent watching shows on their old television or reading library books together on their secondhand couch. They'd cuddle under a blanket and watch movies, making popcorn on the stove because they couldn't afford to go to the theater. Michael would sometimes apologize for not being able to take Victoria out for dinner or to see a show, but she'd tell him honestly that she was happy just being with him. Those quiet evenings at home, talking and laughing together, were precious to her because they felt like proof that love really could be enough to make you happy. Victoria thought they were building something strong and real that would be worth all the sacrifice when they finally made it through to better times. But late at night, when Michael was sleeping peacefully beside her, Victoria would sometimes lie awake feeling overwhelmed by the weight of their financial pressure and wondering if this was really just a temporary situation or if this was going to be their life forever. She'd think about her coworkers who seemed to have normal lives with savings accounts and vacation plans, and she'd wonder what they were doing wrong or why everything seemed so much harder for them than for other people. Michael always seemed so calm about their situation, so confident that things would work out. And sometimes Victoria envied his ability to stay positive when she felt like she was drowning in stress and exhaustion. She never told him about these late-night worries because she didn't want to add to his burden, but the weight of trying to hold everything together was slowly wearing her down in ways she didn't even realize at the time. That Tuesday started like any other day, except Victoria had managed to save enough money to buy Michael's favorite sandwich from the deli near the hospital. It was turkey and Swiss with honey mustard on sourdough bread, something that cost $12, but that she knew would make him smile after what she assumed was another difficult day of cleaning offices. She was so excited to surprise him that she could barely concentrate on her patients that morning. During her lunch break, Victoria packed the sandwich carefully in a paper bag with a little note telling him how much she loved and appreciated his hard work. She thought this small gesture would brighten his day and show him that even though money was tight, she still wanted to do special things for him. Victoria had never visited Michael at his work before because he always said the office buildings where he worked didn't allow family members, and she respected that boundary. But that day, she decided to take the risk and just leave the sandwich with the security guard or whoever was at the front desk. She took the bus across town to the address he had given her, which she had written down on a piece of paper that she kept in her wallet. During the 20-minute bus ride, Victoria rehearsed what she would say to whoever was working the front desk, hoping they would be kind enough to make sure Michael got his surprise lunch. She was nervous but excited, imagining the smile on his face when someone told him his wife had brought him something special. When Victoria got off the bus at the address Michael had given her, she stood on the sidewalk staring up at a gleaming 40-story office tower that looked nothing like what she had imagined. This wasn't some small office building where her husband worked as a night janitor. This was Thompson Industries, one of the largest construction and development companies in Colorado. The building had a massive glass facade, expensive landscaping, and a steady stream of well-dressed business people walking in and out through revolving doors. Victoria checked the address on her piece of paper 3 times, thinking she must have made a mistake or gotten off at the wrong stop. But the numbers matched exactly, and this was definitely where Michael had told her he worked. Victoria walked into the lobby with her paper bag lunch, feeling completely out of place in her simple clothes among all the people in expensive suits. The lobby was massive, with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and abstract art that probably cost more than Michael and she made a year. She approached the reception desk, where a perfectly groomed woman in a designer suit looked at her with polite confusion. When Victoria asked about Michael Thompson, who worked as a janitor in the building, she gave her the strangest look and asked her to wait a moment while she made a phone call. Victoria stood there feeling more confused by the minute, clutching that sandwich and wondering why everything felt so wrong. The receptionist told Victoria to take the elevator to the 38th floor, which made no sense because why would a janitor work on such a high floor in an executive area? As the elevator climbed higher and higher, her heart started pounding with a dread she couldn't explain. The doors opened to reveal an elegant executive floor with panoramic views of the Rocky Mountains, thick carpeting, and offices that screamed wealth and power. A woman in an expensive suit greeted Victoria and asked if she was Mrs. Thompson, here to see her husband. The way she said Mrs. Thompson sent chills down Victoria's spine because no one had ever called her that before, and Michael had never mentioned that his last name was the same as the company name. She led Victoria down a hallway lined with offices that belonged to vice presidents and senior executives, each one more luxurious than anything she had ever seen in her life. Finally, she stopped in front of a massive corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows and a nameplate that read Michael Thompson, Chief Executive Officer. Through the glass walls, Victoria could see her husband sitting behind an enormous mahogany desk, wearing an expensive suit she had never seen before, speaking confidently on the phone while reviewing documents that looked like multi-million-dollar contracts. This wasn't the man who came home exhausted from cleaning office buildings. This was a powerful business executive who commanded respect and authority. Michael looked up and saw Victoria standing there, and the color drained from his face as their eyes met through the glass. He quickly ended his phone call and stood up, but for a moment he just stared at her like he was seeing a ghost. The transformation was incredible. This was the same man she had kissed goodbye that morning, but he looked like a completely different person in his tailored suit and expensive tie. His hair was perfectly styled, his posture was confident and commanding, and he had an air of authority that Victoria had never seen before. She realized that the tired, humble man who came home to their tiny apartment every night was an act, a performance that he had been putting on for their entire marriage. The lunch bag fell from Victoria's hands, and the sandwich she had been so excited to give him scattered across the expensive carpet. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what she was seeing. This was Michael's real life, this world of power and wealth and luxury that she had never been allowed to see. While she had been working double shifts and selling her grandmother's ring to pay their rent, her husband had been living a double life as the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company. The secretary who had brought her here was looking at Victoria with pity and concern, probably wondering why the CEO's wife looked so shocked to be in her own husband's office. Michael came out of his office and approached Victoria slowly, like she was a wild animal that might bolt at any moment. He tried to reach for her hand, but she pulled away from him, still unable to speak or fully comprehend what was happening. He dismissed his secretary and led Victoria into his office, closing the door behind them. As she looked around at the expensive furniture, the awards on the walls, the family photos that included pictures of him in expensive clothing at what looked like charity galas and business events, Victoria realized that their entire marriage had been built on a foundation of lies. This wasn't a man struggling to make ends meet. This was one of the wealthiest and most powerful business leaders in Colorado. When Victoria finally found her voice, all she could say was, "Who are you?" because the man standing in front of her was a complete stranger. Michael tried to explain, reaching for her again, but she backed away from him like he was dangerous. 5 years of marriage, 5 years of sacrifice and struggle, and working herself to exhaustion, 5 years of believing they were building something together, and it had all been a lie. While she had been selling her family heirlooms and eating peanut butter sandwiches to save money, her husband had been one of the richest men in the state, watching her suffer for his entertainment. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that Victoria felt like her entire world had been ripped away from her in a single moment. The ride home in Michael's expensive car, which Victoria learned he kept parked in the executive garage while pretending to take the bus, was the longest 20 minutes of Victoria's life. Neither of them spoke as the city blurred past through tinted windows that probably cost more than Victoria and Michael's monthly rent. When they walked into the tiny apartment, the space that Victoria had thought was the couple's humble but loving home, everything looked different through the lens of his deception. The second-hand furniture, the mismatched dishes, the worn carpet, all of it suddenly felt like props in an elaborate performance that had been Victoria's life for 5 years. Victoria stood in the middle of the living room, looking around at what she now realized was probably just Michael's idea of playing house with a poor girl who didn't know any better. Michael loosened his tie and sat down on the bed, finally looking like the weight of his deception was crushing him. He tried to start the conversation several times, opening his mouth and then closing it again, as if he couldn't find the right words to explain 5 years of lies. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and filled with what sounded like genuine remorse. He told Victoria that he had wanted to tell her the truth so many times, especially when he watched her working those double shifts or when she sold her grandmother's ring. He said that every day of the marriage had been torture because he loved her but couldn't figure out how to reveal his real identity without destroying everything the couple had built together. Victoria couldn't listen to his explanations without feeling like she was going to explode from the rage and hurt building up inside her. She told him that the couple hadn't built anything together, that the entire relationship had been him watching her like she was some kind of social experiment. While Victoria had been sacrificing everything she cared about, working herself to exhaustion, and living in constant financial stress, Michael had been living in luxury and choosing to watch her suffer. Victoria screamed at him about all the nights she had cried herself to sleep worrying about money, all the dreams she had put on hold, all the time she had gone without basic necessities so the couple could pay the bills. Every sacrifice Victoria had made, every moment of financial panic, every time she had felt guilty for wanting something the couple couldn't afford, it had all been unnecessary suffering that Michael had allowed her to endure. Michael tried to defend himself by explaining that he had wanted to make sure Victoria loved him for who he really was, not for his money or his family's company. He told her about previous relationships where women had only been interested in his wealth and status, and how meeting Victoria had been the first time he felt genuinely loved for his personality and character. He said that when he saw her pay for his coffee that first day, he knew she was different, and he wanted to protect what they had from the corruption that money could bring to relationships. He claimed that he had planned to tell her the truth once they were more established as a couple, but then months turned into years, and the longer he waited, the harder it became to find the right moment. Victoria told him that his explanation made everything worse, not better, because it meant that the entire relationship had been based on his paranoia and his inability to trust her with the truth. If he had really loved her, he would have respected her enough to let her make an informed decision about the relationship instead of manipulating her into proving her love through suffering. She had passed his test every single day for 5 years, sacrificing her health, her dreams, her financial security, and her peace of mind to support what she thought was the couple's shared struggle. But it hadn't been a shared struggle at all. It had been him watching her from his position of privilege while she fought battles that he could have ended with a single phone call to his bank. When Michael tried to touch her, to hold her while she cried, Victoria pushed him away so hard that he stumbled backward. She couldn't bear the thought of him comforting her when he was the source of all her pain and confusion. He kept saying that he loved her, that everything he had done was because he loved her, but Victoria told him that love doesn't involve watching someone you care about suffer when you have the power to help them. Love doesn't mean lying every single day for 5 years, creating elaborate stories about job searches and financial struggles, and allowing your partner to sacrifice their dreams for a problem that doesn't exist. Victoria felt like she had been married to a stranger, like the man she thought she knew and loved had never existed at all. In her rage and heartbreak, Victoria started throwing things at him, not caring what broke or what it cost to replace. She threw the cheap dishes they ate off of, the secondhand books she had bought at thrift stores, the little decorations she had found at garage sales to make the apartment feel like home. With every item she threw, she screamed about another sacrifice she had made, another dream she had deferred, another night she had worked overtime while he sat in boardrooms making decisions about millions of dollars. Victoria threw the picture frames that held photos of the couple's simple life together, realizing that even the memories were contaminated by his lies. Nothing in the home was real. It was all part of an elaborate set designed for the performance of the marriage. Michael just stood there and took it, not trying to defend himself or stop Victoria from destroying the belongings. He looked absolutely devastated, and for the first time since she had met him, Victoria could see what might have been his real emotions without any performance or pretense. He told her that he knew he had hurt her in ways that might be unforgivable, that he had been a coward who was too afraid of losing her to be honest with her. He admitted that watching her struggle had been the hardest thing he had ever done, but that he had convinced himself it was necessary to protect the love from the complications that money brings to relationships. He said that every day he had planned to tell her the truth, but every day he had lost his courage because he knew it might mean losing her forever. Eventually, Victoria's rage burned itself out, and she collapsed on the floor among the broken pieces of the life, sobbing harder than she had ever cried in her adult life. She felt like she had been living in a prison of lies for 5 years, and she couldn't figure out what was real and what had been part of Michael's elaborate deception. Had his love for her been real, or was that just another part of the performance? Had any of the conversations, the intimate moments, the plans for the future been genuine, or had she been talking to a character he was playing? Victoria felt like she had lost not just her husband, but also her entire sense of reality. Because if Michael could lie about something this fundamental for 5 years, how could she ever trust her own judgment about anything ever again? When Victoria finally stopped crying and looked up at Michael, she told him that she needed him to leave and give her space to process what had happened. She couldn't think clearly with him in the apartment, and she couldn't separate her anger from her confusion while he was trying to explain and apologize. He asked her if this meant the marriage was over, and she told him honestly that she didn't know because she felt like she had never really been married to him at all. Victoria had been married to a character, a role he had played, and she had no idea who the real Michael Thompson actually was or whether she could ever love that person. As he packed a bag and prepared to leave the apartment for what might be the last time, Victoria realized that everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and partnership had been shattered in a single afternoon. The next morning, Victoria woke up alone in the bed for the first time in 5 years, and the silence in the apartment felt deafening. Michael had respected her request and left the night before, probably going to whatever mansion or penthouse he actually lived in when he wasn't playing house with her. She spent the morning packing her belongings into the same cardboard boxes they had used when they moved into this apartment as newlyweds. But now each item she wrapped felt like evidence of the lie the marriage had been. Her nursing textbooks, her scrubs, the few pieces of jewelry she hadn't sold to pay bills that apparently never needed to be paid, all of it felt contaminated by the deception that had surrounded the entire relationship. Victoria called Diana, her best friend and fellow nurse, and asked if she could stay with her for a while because she couldn't bear to spend another night in the apartment where she had been unknowingly performing the role of the struggling wife. Diana arrived within an hour of Victoria's call, took one look at her tear-stained face and the boxes scattered around the apartment, and immediately wrapped her in the kind of hug that only a true friend can give. She had always been the practical one in the friendship, the voice of reason when Victoria was being too emotional or impulsive. But that day, she just held her while she cried and told her that whatever had happened, they would figure out together. When Victoria tried to explain about Michael's deception, Diana initially thought she was having some kind of nervous breakdown because the story sounded so unbelievable. A janitor who was secretly a multimillionaire CEO, a husband who watched his wife struggle financially for 5 years while having the power to end her suffering at any moment. Even to her best friend, who knew her better than anyone, the truth sounded like something out of a soap opera rather than real life. Diana's guest room became Victoria's refuge, a small space where she could try to process what had happened to her life without being surrounded by reminders of Michael's deception. But even in this neutral environment, everything felt overwhelming and confusing. Victoria would lie awake at night, replaying every conversation they had ever had about money, every time he had seemed stressed about work, every moment when she had comforted him about the financial struggles. Had any of it been real, or had she been comforting him about the burden of maintaining his elaborate lie? Victoria started questioning everything she thought she knew about the relationship, wondering if his love for her had been genuine or if she had just been an interesting project for a bored rich man. The worst part was that some of her memories of the happiest moments now felt tainted, because she couldn't tell which version of Michael had been present for those experiences. Victoria spent hours looking at photos from the 5 years together, trying to spot clues that she had missed about Michael's real life. Every memory became a flashback of moments when she had struggled financially while he watched her suffer. She remembered selling her grandmother's ring while he sat beside her, pretending to be heartbroken about the situation. Victoria remembered countless nights when she came home exhausted from double shifts, collapsing on the cheap couch while he rubbed her shoulders and told her how proud he was of her hard work. She remembered skipping meals to save money while he ate the simple dinners she prepared, always thanking her for her sacrifices. Every single one of these memories now felt like moments when a wealthy man had watched his wife sacrifice her health, her dreams, and her financial security for problems that didn't exist. For the first week after Victoria moved out, Michael called and texted constantly, but she couldn't bring herself to answer or respond to any of his messages. Diana would hand her the phone when it rang, and Victoria would just stare at his name on the screen until it stopped ringing. His voicemail started off apologetic and desperate, with him begging her to let him explain and promising that he could make everything right if she would just give him a chance. But as the days passed and she didn't respond, his messages became more emotional, with him telling her that he loved her and couldn't live without her, that the marriage was the only real thing in his life, even though it had been built on lies. Victoria wanted to believe him, but she couldn't figure out how to separate his genuine emotions from the performance he had been giving her for 5 years. On the 10th day after Victoria moved out, Diana answered her door to find James, Michael's best friend and lawyer, standing on her porch with flowers and a desperate expression. Victoria had met James a few times over the years, always thinking he was just another struggling professional like Michael and her, never knowing that he was actually the attorney for one of Colorado's wealthiest families. James asked Diana if he could speak with Victoria, explaining that Michael was devastated and hadn't been sleeping or eating since she left. He said that Michael had asked him to try to mediate between them, to help them find a way to work through this crisis without destroying the marriage completely. Diana was protective and initially refused to let him in, but Victoria was curious about what he might say, and part of her was desperate for any information about how Michael was handling the separation. James sat across from Victoria in Diana's living room and tried to explain Michael's side of the story with the skill of a trained attorney and the passion of a loyal friend. He told her that Michael's previous relationships had been disasters because women had only been interested in his wealth and status, using him for expensive gifts and social connections before eventually cheating on him or leaving him for someone even richer. According to James, meeting Victoria had been the first time Michael had experienced genuine love, and he had been terrified of losing that by revealing his true identity. James argued that Michael's deception, while wrong, had come from a place of deep love and fear rather than malice or cruelty. He painted a picture of a man who had been so damaged by gold diggers that he couldn't trust anyone with the truth about his wealth. Victoria told James that his explanation made Michael's behavior even worse, not better, because it meant that Michael had punished her for other women's mistakes without giving her the chance to prove herself honestly. If Michael had been upfront about his wealth from the beginning, she could have shown him that she wasn't interested in his money without having to suffer through 5 years of unnecessary financial stress. Instead, he had set up an elaborate test that put all the burden on her to prove her worthiness while he risked nothing. James tried to argue that Michael had risked everything by pretending to be poor, but Victoria pointed out that Michael could end his suffering at any time by simply telling the truth, while she had no power to end hers because she didn't even know it was based on a lie. Even after James's visit, Victoria couldn't stop the flashbacks from overwhelming her at the worst moments. At work, she would be caring for patients and suddenly remember a specific night when she had worked a double shift while sick with the flu because they needed the money. Victoria remembered Michael bringing her soup and telling her how much he appreciated her dedication, how he promised that someday the hard work would pay off. Now she knew that he could have paid off all the debts with pocket change, that he had watched her push herself past her limits for his psychological experiment. These memories would hit her so hard that she would have to excuse herself and cry in supply closets, trying to pull herself together enough to continue caring for her patients who actually needed her help. After James's intervention failed to change her mind, Victoria realized that she needed to take control of her own healing process instead of waiting for Michael or his representatives to convince her to forgive him. She started thinking seriously about what she would need from Michael if she were ever going to consider rebuilding the relationship, and what boundaries she would need to protect herself from being deceived again. Diana encouraged her to focus on her own needs and desires rather than Michael's explanations and apologies, reminding her that she had the power to decide what her future looked like. For the first time since discovering his true identity, Victoria started to feel like she might be able to make decisions about her life based on what she wanted rather than just reacting to Michael's choices. 3 weeks after Victoria moved out, Diana answered her door to find an elegant woman in her late 50s wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than Victoria made in 6 months. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Thompson, Michael's mother, and asked to speak with Victoria about the situation with her son. Victoria had never met Michael's mother during the 5 years of marriage because he had always said she lived far away and they weren't close. But now Victoria realized that was probably another lie. Margaret had an air of authority and wealth that was unmistakable, the kind of presence that comes from years of making important decisions and being accustomed to getting what you want. Diana was immediately suspicious and protective, but Victoria was curious about what Michael's mother might have to say, especially since she represented the world that Michael had hidden from her for so long. Margaret sat in Diana's modest living room like she was holding court, her posture perfect and her expression carefully controlled. At first, she was exactly what Victoria expected from the mother of a wealthy CEO, cold, judgmental, and clearly viewing Victoria as beneath her son's social status. She made subtle comments about Diana's apartment, about Victoria's simple clothes, and about how different her world was from the one Michael had grown up in. Victoria could see that she was sizing her up, trying to figure out what kind of person had managed to capture her son's attention for 5 years without knowing about his wealth. Her initial tone suggested that she thought Victoria was either incredibly naive or perhaps running some kind of long-term con, and Victoria found herself getting defensive about her genuine ignorance of Michael's true identity. But as the conversation continued, something in Margaret's demeanor began to change. She asked Victoria detailed questions about the relationship, about the sacrifices she had made, about how she had supported Michael during what she thought were his struggles. When Victoria told her about selling her grandmother's ring, about working double shifts, about postponing her dreams to help with the finances, she saw Margaret's expression soften in a way that surprised her. She seemed genuinely shocked that Victoria had made such significant sacrifices for someone she believed was financially struggling, and Victoria could see her reevaluating her initial assessment of her character and motivations. It was as if she was realizing for the first time that Victoria's love for Michael had been completely genuine and selfless. Margaret told Victoria that in all the years she had watched women pursue Michael for his wealth and status, she had never seen anyone make the kind of sacrifices that Victoria had made. She said that most of the women Michael had dated had been focused on expensive gifts, luxury vacations, and social connections, while Victoria had been focused on building a life with someone she thought needed her support. She admitted that when Michael first told her about Victoria years ago, she had assumed she was just another gold digger who was playing a longer game, but seeing the evidence of her genuine sacrifices had completely changed her perspective. Margaret said that she now understood why Michael had fallen so deeply in love with Victoria, because she was the first woman who had loved him for his character rather than his bank account. Margaret began to share stories about Michael's past relationships that helped Victoria understand the depth of his trust issues, though they didn't excuse his deception. She told her about women who had pretended to love him while secretly maxing out credit cards he had given them, about fiancés who had cheated on him with his business partners, about relationships that had ended the moment he tried to set any boundaries around his wealth. She painted a picture of a man who had been used and manipulated so many times that he had lost the ability to trust anyone's motivations when it came to romantic relationships. Margaret said that Michael had been convinced that genuine love was impossible for someone in his position, that every woman who claimed to care about him was ultimately motivated by what he could provide rather than who he was as a person. While Victoria could understand how Michael's past experiences had damaged his ability to trust, She told Margaret that his solution had been to damage her instead of dealing with his own issues in a healthy way. She explained that he had essentially punished her for other women's crimes without giving her the opportunity to prove herself honestly from the beginning. If he had been upfront about his wealth, and she had stayed with him anyway, he would have had his proof that she loved him for himself. Instead, he had chosen to put her through years of unnecessary suffering to test her character, which felt more like emotional manipulation than protection. Margaret listened carefully to Victoria's perspective, and she could see that she was beginning to understand how her son's fear of being used had led him to use her in a different, but equally harmful way. Margaret surprised Victoria by taking some responsibility for Michael's behavior, admitting that she had probably contributed to his trust issues by being overly involved in screening his previous relationships. She said that she had always been suspicious of any woman who showed interest in Michael, often hiring private investigators to research their backgrounds and motivations. She had created an environment where Michael felt like he couldn't trust his own judgment about women, where every relationship felt like a potential threat to the family's wealth and reputation. Margaret said that she now realized her overprotectiveness had prevented Michael from developing healthy relationship skills and had taught him to view love as something that needed to be tested and verified rather than freely given and received. Margaret told Victoria that she believed Michael's love for her was the most genuine emotion he had ever experienced, and that losing her would destroy him in ways that no previous breakup had. She said that she had watched him become a better, happier person during the marriage, even though she hadn't understood at the time why he was living so modestly. She admitted that she had been confused by his lifestyle choices, but had respected his desire for privacy about his personal life. Margaret argued that while Michael's methods had been wrong, his intentions had been to protect something precious, and that the love was worth fighting for if they could find a way to rebuild trust. She asked Victoria to consider giving Michael another chance, not for his sake or hers, but because she believed that what they had was rare and valuable. Margaret's visit forced Victoria to consider Michael's perspective in a way that she hadn't before, though it didn't immediately change her feelings about his deception. She could understand how his past experiences had created deep-seated trust issues, and she could even empathize with his fear of being used for his wealth. But understanding his motivations didn't erase the pain of feeling like she had been tested and manipulated for 5 years without her knowledge or consent. Victoria told Margaret that even if Michael's intentions had been to protect the love, the result had been that he had damaged it possibly beyond repair. Trust, once broken, is incredibly difficult to rebuild, especially when the betrayal had been so fundamental and long-lasting. Before Margaret left, she gave Victoria her personal phone number and told her that if she ever decided she wanted to try to work things out with Michael, she would support them in whatever way she could. She said that she had spent years being suspicious of women in Michael's life, but that she now considered Victoria to be the daughter-in-law she had always hoped for, someone who truly loved her son for who he was rather than what he could provide. Margaret's visit didn't solve anything immediately, but it did plant seeds of possibility in Victoria's mind about whether the marriage might be salvageable if Michael was willing to do the hard work of rebuilding trust and being completely honest going forward. For the first time since discovering his deception, Victoria began to consider whether forgiveness might be possible, even if it seemed impossible at that moment. After Margaret's visit, Michael's attempts to win Victoria back became more desperate and elaborate, though they only served to highlight the vast difference between his real resources and the poverty he had pretended to live in. He started showing up at the hospital where Victoria worked, not to talk to her directly since she had made it clear she wasn't ready for that, but just to watch her from his expensive car in the parking lot. Victoria's co-workers began noticing the well-dressed man who seemed to be following her, and she had to explain that it was her estranged husband without going into the details of why they were separated. The sight of him sitting there in his luxury vehicle while she walked to the bus stop in her worn scrubs felt like a perfect metaphor for the entire relationship. Him watching her struggles from a position of comfort and privilege. The first of Michael's grand gestures came in the form of an anonymous donation to Denver General Hospital's Nursing Education Fund, money that would have allowed Victoria and several other nurses to pursue advanced degrees without taking on crushing debt. When the hospital administrator called Victoria into her office to tell her about the scholarship that had been created specifically for nurses in her situation, she knew immediately that Michael was behind it. The donation was for exactly the amount she would have needed to become a nurse practitioner, down to the penny, which meant he had been paying attention to her dreams even while he was lying about his ability to help her achieve them. While part of Victoria was grateful for the opportunity, she was also furious that he was trying to solve their problems with money after spending 5 years watching her believe that money was their biggest obstacle. A few days later, Victoria discovered that all of her personal debts had been mysteriously paid off. Her student loans from nursing school, the credit card she had maxed out during their worst financial periods, even the small loan she had taken to buy her car. When she called the companies to ask about the payments, they told her that anonymous benefactors had settled her accounts in full. Diana found Victoria crying at her kitchen table, not because she was ungrateful for the financial relief, but because she felt like Michael was trying to buy her forgiveness instead of earning it through genuine change and accountability. Every debt he paid off was a reminder of sacrifice she had made unnecessarily, money she had struggled to repay, while he had millions sitting in accounts she didn't know existed. When Victoria finally confronted Michael about his financial interventions, she found him waiting by her car after her shift ended. She told him that his money couldn't fix what was broken between them, that paying her debts didn't erase the fact that he had watched her accumulate those debts through years of unnecessary struggle. He tried to explain that he just wanted to remove the financial stress so that they could focus on rebuilding the relationship. But Victoria made it clear that his attempts to solve everything with money were actually making things worse. She didn't want to be bought or rescued. She wanted a partner who trusted her enough to be honest from the beginning. His grand gestures felt more like guilt payments than genuine attempts at reconciliation, and they highlighted how fundamentally he misunderstood what she needed from him. Diana helped Victoria process her conflicted feelings about Michael's attempts to win her back, pointing out that his methods revealed how out of touch he was with what had actually hurt her. She observed that he was still approaching their problems from a position of power and privilege, using his wealth to try to control the situation rather than addressing the fundamental issue of trust and honesty. Diana reminded Victoria that the money had never been the real problem. The lies and manipulation had been the problem, and throwing money at the situation couldn't solve that. She encouraged Victoria to think about what she would actually need from Michael to even consider reconciliation, and whether he seemed capable of providing those things based on his current behavior. Michael's next attempt was a grand romantic gesture that showed he still didn't understand what Victoria needed from him. He arranged for a flash mob in the hospital lobby during her lunch break, complete with musicians, dancers, and a giant banner asking her to give him another chance. While Victoria's co-workers and patients were charmed by the spectacle, she was mortified by the public nature of his plea and frustrated by his assumption that romance could overcome the fundamental issues in their relationship. The elaborate display felt like another performance, another way for him to control the narrative and put pressure on her to respond positively in front of an audience. Victoria walked away from the entire production, leaving him standing there with his expensive gesture and no understanding of why it had failed to move her. The expensive gifts started arriving daily. Designer clothes, jewelry, flowers, and items that Victoria had mentioned wanting during the marriage, but that they supposedly couldn't afford. Each gift came with a card expressing his love and regret, but they felt more like reminders of his deception than genuine expressions of affection. Victoria returned every single item, often without even opening the packages, because accepting them would have felt like accepting the premise that their problems could be solved through material compensation. The gifts represented everything that was wrong with Michael's approach to the relationship. His belief that his wealth could overcome any obstacle, and his failure to understand that what Victoria wanted was honesty and respect, not expensive objects. James made several more attempts to mediate between Michael and Victoria, but each conversation revealed how differently they were processing what had happened. According to James, Michael was devastated by Victoria's rejection of his gestures and couldn't understand why she wasn't grateful for his attempts to improve her life financially. James tried to argue that Michael's actions showed how much he loved her and wanted to make up for the pain he had caused, but Victoria pointed out that his actions showed he still didn't understand what the real problem was. The issue wasn't that she needed money. The issue was that she needed a partner who would be honest with her and treat her as an equal rather than as a subject in his social experiment. The constant pressure from Michael's grand gestures and James's mediation attempts began to wear Victoria down emotionally, making her feel like she was being manipulated from multiple directions. Every day brought new evidence of Michael's wealth and new attempts to use that wealth to influence her decisions, which felt like a continuation of the power imbalance that had defined the entire relationship. Victoria found herself having panic attacks when she thought about the possibility of going back to him. Not because she didn't love him, but because she couldn't figure out how to trust someone who had demonstrated such a willingness to deceive her for his own purposes. The Michael who was sending gifts and making grand gestures felt like just another character he was playing, and she had no way of knowing if the real Michael was someone she could actually build a life with. Finally, Victoria decided that she needed to make it absolutely clear to Michael that his current approach was not working and was actually pushing her further away from any possibility of reconciliation. She asked James to arrange a meeting where she could explain exactly what she needed from Michael if he wanted any chance of rebuilding the relationship, and what boundaries he needed to respect during this process. Victoria realized that she had been reacting to Michael's gestures rather than clearly communicating her own needs and expectations, and that if there was any hope for the marriage, it would require her to take an active role in defining the terms rather than just responding to his increasingly desperate attempts to win her back through displays of wealth and power. 6 weeks after Victoria had discovered Michael's true identity, James arranged for them to meet at Murphy's Coffee House, the same place where they had first met 6 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on Victoria that they were returning to the scene of what she now knew had been the beginning of Michael's elaborate deception, the place where she had unknowingly stepped into his test by paying for his coffee. When Victoria walked in and saw Michael sitting at their old corner table, he looked like he had lost weight and hadn't been sleeping well. For a moment, seeing him there brought back all the feelings she had tried to suppress, the love that had sustained her through 5 years of what she thought was shared struggle. But then Victoria remembered that the man sitting across from her was not the same person she had fallen in love with all those years ago. Or rather, he was that person, but with layers of deception that she was still trying to understand and process. Michael had dressed simply for their meeting, wearing jeans and a plain shirt that reminded Victoria of how he used to dress when they were married, and she realized that even this choice felt calculated to her now. Everything about his appearance seemed designed to remind her of the version of him that she had loved, but Victoria couldn't tell if this was the real Michael or just another performance tailored to what he thought she wanted to see. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and filled with what seemed like genuine remorse. But Victoria found herself analyzing every word and gesture, trying to determine what was authentic and what might be manipulation. The trust that had once allowed her to accept everything he said at face value was completely gone, replaced by a hypervigilance that made every interaction feel exhausting and uncertain. Michael told Victoria that he had made the most difficult decision of his life. He was renouncing his inheritance and walking away from Thompson Industries to prove that his love for her was more important than his wealth or family legacy. He said that he had spent the past 6 weeks realizing that he couldn't ask her to trust him while he was still living the life that had enabled his deception in the first place. He had given up his position as CEO, moved out of his family estate, and was planning to start over with nothing more than what he could earn through honest work. Michael said that he wanted to build a real life with Victoria, one based on truth and equality rather than the power imbalance that had defined their entire relationship. He was essentially offering to become the person he had pretended to be, to make his performance into reality. While part of Victoria was moved by Michael's dramatic gesture, another part of her was frustrated that he still seemed to think that grand actions could solve the fundamental problems between them. She told him that she didn't need him to be poor to prove his love. She needed him to be honest and to treat her as an equal partner in making decisions about their life together. His willingness to give up his wealth was impressive, but also felt like another way of controlling the narrative and putting the burden on her to either accept his sacrifice or be seen as the ungrateful wife who couldn't forgive him. Victoria explained that the issue wasn't his money itself, but his willingness to lie to her for years and his assumption that he had the right to test her character without her knowledge or consent. For the first time since Victoria had discovered his deception, Michael and she had a completely honest conversation about their relationship, their fears, and what they both needed to move forward. Victoria told him about the nights she had cried herself to sleep worrying about money, about the dreams she had postponed, about the constant stress of trying to make ends meet while he watched her struggle from his position of privilege. Michael shared details about his past relationships that helped her understand his fears, but he also acknowledged that his solution had been to hurt her instead of dealing with his trust issues in a healthy way. They talked about the moments in their marriage when he had wanted to tell her the truth, but had lost his courage, and Victoria began to see him as a flawed, frightened person rather than a calculating manipulator. Michael broke down completely as he described watching Victoria sell her grandmother's ring, saying that it had been the hardest moment of his entire life because he had known he could solve their problems with a single phone call, but had been too afraid of losing her, to be honest. He told her that every sacrifice she had made had felt like a knife in his heart, but that he had convinced himself that their love needed to be tested to be real. Michael admitted that he had been selfish and cowardly, that he had prioritized his own fear of being used over her right to know the truth about the man she had married. For the first time, Victoria could see genuine remorse and self-awareness in his apologies, rather than just desperate attempts to win her back. As Victoria listened to Michael's explanations and apologies, she realized that she was facing a choice between the safety of staying angry and the risk of trying to rebuild something that had been fundamentally damaged. She still loved him, despite everything that had happened, but she wasn't sure if love was enough to overcome the trust issues that his deception had created. Victoria told him that if they were going to have any chance of making their marriage work, he would need to be completely transparent about every aspect of his life going forward, and that rebuilding trust would be a long, difficult process with no guarantees. She also made it clear that she wouldn't be returning to their old dynamic. Any future relationship would need to be based on equality and honesty rather than the paternalistic protection he had thought he was providing. Michael agreed to all of Victoria's conditions and asked if she would be willing to try counseling together to work through their issues with professional help. He said that he understood if she needed more time to decide whether their marriage was worth saving, but that he would wait as long as it took for her to feel ready to try again. For the first time in 6 weeks, Victoria allowed him to hold her hand, and she could feel the familiar comfort of his touch alongside the wariness that his betrayal had created. They sat there in the coffee shop where their story had begun, two people who loved each other but weren't sure if that love could survive the damage that secrets and lies had inflicted on their relationship. Victoria told Michael that she needed more time to process everything he had said and to decide whether she believed that they could build something healthy and honest together. She had learned that love without trust was incredibly painful, and that forgiveness was not the same thing as forgetting or pretending that deep harm hadn't been done. But Victoria had also realized that spending the rest of her life angry and bitter would only hurt her more, and that maybe there was a way to honor both her pain and her love in making this decision. She explained that any attempt at reconciliation would need to be slow and careful, with clear boundaries and expectations, and that he would need to prove his commitment to honesty through actions rather than words. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Michael asked if he could call Victoria in a few days to check in, and she agreed, but with the understanding that she was still not ready to make any decisions about their future. They parted ways without the dramatic reconciliation that he might have hoped for, but also without the finality that she had been considering just weeks earlier. Walking away from that meeting, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced since discovering his deception. The possibility that their story might not be over, that there might be a way to rebuild something real and lasting from the ruins of their marriage. It wouldn't be easy, and there were no guarantees, but for the first time in months, Victoria felt like she had some power in determining what happened next. 6 months after their meeting at the coffee shop, Michael and Victoria were sitting in Dr. Martinez's office for their weekly couples therapy session, a ritual that had become the foundation of their slow journey toward rebuilding trust. The early sessions had been incredibly difficult. With Victoria expressing years of accumulated hurt and Michael learning to listen without becoming defensive or trying to fix everything with grand gestures. Dr. Martinez had helped them understand that healing from betrayal is not a linear process, that there would be good days and setbacks, moments of connection and periods of doubt. They had learned to communicate about their fears and needs in ways that they never had during their original marriage, ironically developing better relationship skills in the aftermath of their crisis than they had ever possessed when they thought everything was perfect. They had moved into a small but comfortable apartment in a middle-class neighborhood, a space that represented their commitment to building something new rather than trying to return to their old life. Michael was keeping his promise to live modestly, working as a maintenance supervisor at a local school district while slowly building a small consulting business that used his management skills without relying on his family connections. Their new home was furnished with pieces they had chosen together, bought with money they had both earned through honest work. Every decision about their living space was made jointly, from the paint colors to the furniture arrangement, as they practiced the kind of equal partnership that had been missing from their original marriage when Victoria didn't know the full truth about their circumstances. Victoria had finally enrolled in the nurse practitioner program that she had dreamed about for so many years, using a combination of scholarships, savings, and a small loan that they had discussed and agreed upon together. Michael was incredibly supportive of her education, helping her study when she needed it and taking over household responsibilities when she had heavy course loads or clinical rotations. There was something healing about finally pursuing her professional goals with a partner who was genuinely invested in her success, rather than someone who could have funded her education effortlessly but chose to watch her postpone her dreams instead. Every milestone in her studies felt like a victory, not just for her career, but for their relationship's progress toward true equality and mutual support. Michael had surprised both of them by finding genuine satisfaction in his work at the school district, where his responsibilities included everything from basic repairs to coordinating major maintenance projects. He told Victoria that there was something deeply satisfying about solving practical problems and seeing the immediate results of his efforts, work that felt more meaningful than the abstract financial decisions he had made as a CEO. His co-workers respected him for his competence and work ethic, having no idea about his wealthy background, and he was building friendships based on shared interests and mutual respect rather than business connections or social status. Watching him find purpose in honest work had helped Victoria believe that his transformation was genuine rather than just another performance designed to win her back. Their daily routines had developed into a pattern of genuine partnership that they had never achieved during their original marriage. They shared cooking responsibilities, household chores, and financial decisions in ways that felt natural and equitable. Michael had learned to be completely transparent about money, showing Victoria every paycheck, every expense, and every financial decision before making it. Victoria had learned to trust again, slowly and carefully, but with increasing confidence that the man she was living with was finally showing her his authentic self. Their conversations about money, work, and future plans were now characterized by honesty and mutual respect rather than the one-sided sacrifice that had defined their earlier relationship. The rebuilding process hadn't been without setbacks and challenges that tested their commitment to this new version of their relationship. There were moments when Victoria would be triggered by memories of his deception, times when she would question whether she could ever fully trust him again, and days when the weight of rebuilding seemed too overwhelming to bear. Michael had his own struggles with adjusting to a life without the safety net of wealth, dealing with stress and uncertainty in ways he had never experienced before. They had learned to talk through these difficulties rather than letting them fester, to be honest about their fears and doubts without letting them derail their progress. Dr. Martinez had taught them that healing required them to face these challenges together rather than pretending they didn't exist. Margaret had become an unexpected source of support for their reconciliation, visiting them regularly and treating Victoria with the respect and affection that she had never received during their original marriage when she didn't know Victoria existed. She had admitted that watching Michael choose love over wealth had changed her perspective on what really mattered, and she seemed genuinely proud of the man her son was becoming through this difficult process. Margaret had also made peace with Michael's decision to walk away from the family business, eventually telling them that she respected his choice to build something of his own rather than living off inherited privilege. Her acceptance of their new life had been important for Michael's emotional healing, as he had feared that choosing Victoria would mean losing his family forever. After 4 months of therapy and steady progress in rebuilding their relationship, they had begun talking about renewing their wedding vows in a ceremony that would represent their commitment to this new, honest version of their marriage. Unlike their first wedding, which had been based on deception and hidden truths, this ceremony would involve family and friends who knew their full story and were supporting their decision to try again. They wanted to create new memories and new promises that would acknowledge the pain they had caused each other, while also celebrating their choice to fight for their love despite the damage that had been done. The planning process itself had become an opportunity to practice the kind of joint decision-making that they were still learning to navigate. As Victoria looked at Michael reading beside her on their couch one evening, she realized that she had finally begun to see him as a complete person rather than either the struggling janitor she had fallen in love with or the wealthy deceiver who had broken her heart. He was both and neither of those versions, a complex human being who had made terrible choices out of fear and pain, but who was working every day to become someone worthy of the trust he had damaged. Their love had survived the revelation of his lies, but it had been transformed into something more mature and realistic, built on a foundation of honesty rather than the fantasy that had sustained their original relationship. Victoria still didn't know if they would make it in the long run, but she had learned to find peace in the uncertainty rather than needing guarantees about their future. Looking back on everything that happened, Victoria had learned that love alone isn't enough to sustain a relationship, but that love combined with honesty, respect, and genuine commitment to growth can overcome even the most devastating betrayals. Michael and Victoria were still building their new life together, one honest conversation at a time, one shared decision at a time, one day of trust at a time. They had discovered that true love isn't about passing tests or proving yourself worthy. It's about choosing each other every day with full knowledge of each other's flaws and fears. Their story wasn't a fairy tale with a perfect ending, but it was a real story about real people learning that the most beautiful thing you can build with someone is a life based on truth. What's your story of love, forgiveness, and second chances? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories that remind everyone that love, when it's real and honest, can indeed conquer all.